Okay, so next we're going to discuss how animal groups on several different lineages were able to colonize land. Okay, we had bilaterian animals in both vertebrate and invertebrate groups entering land after the Cambrian explosion. Okay, this allowed for very drastic or profound changes in terrestrial communities. Remember that fungi and plants got there first. We needed those for the basis of the food chain, and that facilitated animal colonization of land later. Okay, so life on land provided a lot of advantages and challenges to early colonizers. Okay, we've already talked about this with plants, and many of the challenges and opportunities for animals were similar to those in plants. Okay, the atmosphere of the earth at the time that animals colonized the land was higher in oxygen concentration than the aquatic environments. Okay, even though early photosynthetic organisms were producing oxygen in the water, much of that oxygen escaped into the air. Since animals were aerobic respirators and they all use oxygen, having so much oxygen available is certainly an advantage. There were also new sources of food, different types of land plants than there were in the ocean, and fewer competitors. Certainly that changed after a long history of time on land, but the first animals to get there had it really good. They didn't have much competition. One of the challenges, or one of the disadvantages to living on land, was that obviously water was a lot less abundant on land than in the water. Okay, so the animals had to evolve a way of conserving water and preventing them from drying out. Also, temperature fluctuations were a lot greater. Water holds in heat and it tends to change temperature very slowly, whereas air can fluctuate a great deal between high and low temperatures. So certainly temperature regulation was a lot more challenging for animals on land. There was also no support against gravity. Okay, that was a similar challenge that plants and animals faced. Think about how when seaweed washes up on shore, it is very floppy. Okay, but in the water, it looks kind of tree-like, and the water holds it up easily. So both animals and plants had to provide some kind of structural support to facilitate living on land. Okay, many members of many animal groups made the transition to terrestrial life. Okay, so I don't ask you to memorize the number of transitions to life on land that were made, but you do need to know that it happened in animal groups many different times in many different lineages. Okay, it wasn't just a single animal going on land and then diversifying. We had vertebrates and invertebrates colonizing land in separate events. Okay, arthropods were some of the first animals to colonize the land about 450 million years ago. If you think back to Unit 2, land plants have been here since at least 470 million years ago. Okay, so the plants had a chance to get here and get established and set up some suitable food sources for the arthropods, kind of paving the way for animal life on land. Okay, later vertebrates colonized land about 365 million years ago, so much later than the first invertebrates. So the evolutionary changes that happened along with the transition to terrestrial life in animals were much less extensive than the transitions that plants had to make for life on land. Okay, and that's because animals already had a lot of the adaptations that were suitable for helping them to survive on land. Okay, so this table here illustrates some of the changes that each group, the plants, the arthropods, and the vertebrates had to make in order to survive on land. If we look at the plants, the ancestor of plants was a type of green alga, some type of charophyte, and it had no anchoring structure, no roots. That was something that had to be evolved as a new adaptation when the plant entered land. Okay, it had no structural support. It needed to evolve something like lignin in order for the plant to stay upright at any reasonable height. It had no internal transportation system. Okay, water and minerals would dissolve in and out of the algae cells, and in order to survive on land, plants evolved a vascular tissue system. Muscle and nerve cells not applicable to plants. But protection against desiccation. Okay, desiccation is a fancy word for drying out. So the plants had to evolve a structure, the waxy cuticle, to help keep water in. And they also had to evolve a system of gas exchange. And those were the stomata on the plants. Okay, they let gases in and out, whereas in the water, gases dissolved in the water would simply move in and out passively through diffusion. Okay, so that's 5 really big, really major adaptations that plants had to make in order to survive on land. Okay, marine crustaceans already had a lot of the adaptations that terrestrial crustaceans would need to survive on land. Okay, the anchoring structure was not applicable to animals, since animals are mobile, but they already had a support structure. Okay, they had an exoskeleton that was common in marine arthropods. Remember, an exoskeleton is one of the distinguishing characteristics of arthropods. So when the first arthropods entered land, they had no trouble staying upright, not flopping apart. An internal transportation system was already apparent. Okay, think about the digestive system, that cavity moving food and water and nutrients throughout the length of the body of the organism. Muscle and nerve cells were also necessary for walking around on land. Okay, both vertebrates and invertebrates in the water had those. Okay, they weren't present in some of the simplest organisms like the sponges and cnidarians, but the marine crustaceans had muscle and nerve cells. And protection against desiccation or drying out was also present. Okay, that exoskeleton had many different functions. It protected against predators, and that's why it was adaptive in the water. But on land, it was also very handy in preventing drying out. So there was only one major adjustment that the arthropods had to make when moving onto land, okay, and that was the tracheal system of gas exchange. Okay, they had to extract the gases like oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide in a different way than they did in water. Okay, and the tracheal system is something that we'll talk about in a later chapter, but it's simply a network of tubes and small compartments that allow gases to travel throughout the body of the organism. If we look at the vertebrates, just like the invertebrates, they didn't need an anchoring structure. Only plants needed to do that. They had some support structures already in place in aquatic organisms. Okay, they had a skeletal system that evolved before vertebrates entered land. But they needed some extra support. Okay, the fins of fish were not very good for walking around on land, so they needed to evolve the limbs for walking on land. Internal transportation system was already available. The cardiovascular system would get a lot of nutrients and so forth around the body of the organism. They also had the digestive system for pulling nutrients through the body. Muscle and nerve cells were also already there. They were useful for both life on land and life in the water. Protection against desiccation was a major thing that vertebrates did have to evolve. Okay? They evolved the amniotic egg, which helped to assist with reproduction on land. We'll talk about that more in a moment. And they also had to have a different type of scale than the fish had. Okay, that was a trait that evolved in reptiles, a tough, scaly skin for keeping water in. So invertebrates had one major trait that they had to evolve for life on land. Vertebrates had 2, and plants had 5. Okay, so it's apparent that it was a lot easier for vertebrates to make the transition and invertebrates, so it was a lot easier for all animals to transition to life on land than for plants. So that probably explains why in the animal lineage the transition was made many times, and in plants, land was only invaded once, and then plants diversified on land at a later time. Okay, so terrestrial lineages have arisen separately in several different arthropod groups. Okay, so this includes millipedes, spiders, crabs, and insects. So simply remember that arthropods invaded land many different times. Okay, the appendages, like arms and legs and antennae, of some types of living arthropods have been modified for functions on land, such as walking, feeding, sensory reception, taking in information, reproduction, and defense. Okay, so even though the basics were there for them to be able to do well on land, some of the features were fine-tuned a little bit. But the appendages remained jointed and paired in both aquatic and terrestrial arthropods. The body of an arthropod is completely covered by what we call a cuticle. You might also have heard of it referred to as an exoskeleton. Okay, it's made of layers of protein and chitin. Chitin is a polysaccharide, and together the protein and chitin provide a very tough covering. Okay, it provides structural support, so in the absence of an internal skeleton, it keeps the organism upright, even though air provides a lot less support than water. It provides attachment points for muscles that allowed a diversity of types of movements, and it protected the organism from predators and drying out. Okay, it's sort of like an armor. It's very tough, and it prevents a lot of bumps and scrapes. But a lot of organs for gas exchange have more recently evolved on land in arthropods. The insects are a group that we'll mention briefly because they're extremely diverse even among the arthropods. Okay, insects and their relatives include more species than all of the other groups of eukaryotes combined. Okay, so you add up plants, fungi, protists, vertebrates, everything else, it cannot even compare to the amazing diversity of insects. Okay, insects get kind of a bad reputation. There are a few species that provide economic problems, but overall, they're a very beautiful, very interesting, and very diverse group. Okay, they can live in almost every terrestrial habitat, and they also live in fresh water. And the oldest insect fossils date to about 416 million years ago. Okay, so slightly earlier than arthropods entered land. Okay, so now we're going to talk about colonization of life on land by the vertebrates in a little bit more detail. Okay, we've already talked about some of the pre-adaptations that marine vertebrates had that made life on land possible and made the transition a lot easier than it was for plants. But remember that of the groups of vertebrates that existed on land, only one of them was really suitable for moving around or to evolving into a lineage that could move around effectively on land. Okay, the fins of some lobe-finned fishes were modified and eventually evolved into legs and feet of the tetrapods. An important fossil that was involved in describing how this transition occurred is known as Tiktaalik. Okay, that's the genus name for the fossil that we affectionately call a fishapod. Okay, it gets this name fishapod because it's got characteristics of both fish and of tetrapods. It's essentially an intermediate organism between the fish and the early amphibians. Okay, it had fins, gills, lungs, and scales, much like the existing fish. But it also had ribs that allowed breathing and supporting its body. So its rib structure was a little bit different than a lot of fish at the time. It also had a neck and shoulders, unlike fish, so the shape of its body was different. And the fins were a bit fish-like, but they were also evolving more towards the pattern of a modern tetrapod limb. Okay, so they were essentially intermediate between fins and legs. Let's look at the skeleton of the fossil Tiktaalik so we can see how this occurred. Okay. They had both gills and lungs. Wow, how handy. So they were able to breathe on either land or water. The scales and fins were characters of fish. But notice how the shape of the organism is very different from a fish. Most fish, with the exception of flounders and some bottom-dwelling fish, most fish are laterally compressed. That means they're kind of flattened from side to side. Okay, Tiktaalik had a head that was flattened from top to bottom. So this allowed the flat skull and the eyes on top of the skull. And having the eyes on top were an important adaptation for looking around and seeing what was on land. Okay, finding prey and being able to effectively move on land meant that they had to see what was out there. Okay, the neck and the ribs allowed the animal to turn its head and to expand its rib cage and breathe well. So those were important adaptations for life on land. And then if we look at the structure of the fin skeleton, we can see how even though it's roughly fin-shaped, it has a strong central bone. Okay, notice the humerus. That's very similar to our upper leg bone. And you almost see a bit of a wrist forming. And some of those long, skinnier bones near the tip of the fossil are kind of like fingers. Okay, so you can see this fin evolving to be more and more like a leg. The Tiktaalik could probably prop itself up on its fins and put its head out of water, but the limbs were not yet ready for walking around on land. Okay. So Tiktaalik is considered an ancestor of the tetrapod lineage. Okay, even though it's intermediate between a fish and a tetrapod, we consider it to be the earliest organism that was classified as a tetrapod. Over time, the descendants of Tiktaalik became more and more limb-like, or more and more like the legs of modern tetrapods. Okay, so the first truly land-dwelling tetrapods evolved around 365 million years ago, or about 5 million years after the Tiktaalik fossil was a living organism. So this phylogeny here shows the gradual change in limb structure over time. We have fully aquatic organisms living before Tiktaalik, the lungfishes, Eusthenopteron, and Pandrichthyes. Okay, so notice how the fins of these organisms are very paddle-like. Okay, Tiktaalik has the development of more finger-like bones inside of the fin and a shrinking paddle-like structure. An organism that evolved shortly after Tiktaalik was Acanthostega. So it's lost that paddle-like structure around the outside of the fin, and the extensions on the end of its limbs are more finger-like, which probably assisted with walking around on land, maybe not very well, but maybe kind of wiggling and pushing itself around and moving frequently between land and water. We then have Tulerpaton, okay, which limbs are a lot more like modern day tetrapods. Although over time, the leg bones did get longer and longer and allow a more upright posture and faster movement on land. Okay, we then have two groups that now live on land, the amphibians and the amniotes. Okay, and the amniotes include reptiles as well as mammals. Okay, so the amphibians are now represented by about 6,150 species, and these include the groups frogs, salamanders, and caecilians. Amphibians are well known for their metamorphosis. Okay, so they have sort of an intermediate lifestyle between aquatic and terrestrial. So the amphibians have gill-bearing aquatic larvae. So as a young organism, the amphibians are extracting oxygen from the water. They later undergo metamorphosis, or a fundamental change in their physiology, and then become lung-bearing, air-breathing adults that live on land. Okay, so the amphibians diverged from the other tetrapods the earliest. Modern-day amphibians now are restricted to damp habitats, which reflects their evolutionary history of being water-dwelling organisms. Even though most amphibians have an aquatic life stage, there are a few that don't lay their eggs in water. Okay, they lay their eggs in damp areas, and their larval stage is passed through during the egg phase. Okay, but because their eggs lack a shell and they're kind of a jelly-like substance, they need to stay moist all the time. They're very vulnerable to drying out. Okay, so notice how they're transparent, and that jelly-like substance has no mechanism for holding in water. Their skin is also required to be moist at all times. Okay, it facilitates gas exchange because the amphibian has a specialized skin that can only transfer gases when it's moist. Okay, so amphibians are kind of in between a terrestrial and an aquatic lifestyle. This picture here shows the three main groups of amphibians. We have the salamanders, which retain their tails as adults and have sort of a lizard-like body shape. The frogs and toads have lost their tails and have very highly developed hind legs that are very good for jumping. And then we have the caecilians. Okay, you may not have heard of the caecilians, but it's a group that has lost its legs over evolutionary time, and they tend to be burrowing animals. So here's a good question for you to think about. Is a caecilian a tetrapod? Yes or no? Okay, you might have said no because it doesn't actually have legs, but we would consider it a tetrapod because of its evolutionary history. Its ancestors had legs, so that makes it a tetrapod, since tetrapods are a monophyletic group, and we've got to include them in order for that monophyletic status to hold true.